Okay, so thank you. Welcome back, Mary. We really appreciate you taking the time to share your thoughts around grief with the rest of the community.
Thank you. I'm curious, is there anyone that has been able to watch the last one and think about it over the week as a starting point?
Yeah, you can use Jade. Have been too busy. Yes, been thinking about it.
I'm not sure about you guys anyway. Over the week, thought about it a fair bit and how I think there's so many avenues that people could follow if they wanted to study this further, because it is something that's, I think it's probably fundamental to what we do. And I think having that evidence base behind us now helps to sort of cement some starting points. So I'm going to continue today with being quite exploratory. I really encourage people to just bring forward any thoughts or any ideas as we go through the content. So we finished off last time looking at when there's changes to closeness that we might see, we might experience different emotions, and two examples of that was anger and guilt. So what we're going to do now is we're going to do a bit of a thought experiment. So I'm going to be asking a fair few questions of you. So just take you with each of these. I'm going to go through a scenario. Then there's going to be a challenge put forward, and let's just think about how or what we might see that person might experience. You may not see something, but you may see something. And this is just about just opening it up. So we're thinking along these lines. So imagine or think back to a time when you were holding a baby. It could be your baby. And the compulsion when you put them down to sleep and you go and check on them, the compulsion to stay just to make sure that they're taking another breath. What did that closeness feel like? And when you're prevented from taking that moment of closeness, what do you experience? Emotions are internal experiences that compel us to do something. They are functional. Studies have shown that neurobiological functions change when a person becomes a parent, such as a mother becomes more likely to be protective, for instance. Let's think about an intrusive thought of less closeness with their children. What types of experiences might come up for somebody if it's just an intrusive thought? It's not something that's in the environment. It's just a quick flash. Is there any emotions that come up? Any quick sensations? Any responses in the body?
Fear that they not go. I get back to the first time my son slept through the night. I woke up, he was much younger than his sisters, so I woke up very in need of breastfeeding, and I didn't just stand taking a moment. I shook the poor little bugger until he screamed, and
Oh.
not in a bad shaking, but yeah, he was too quiet.
Yeah. So for you, was it like that was automatic?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. It was just like, wake up, what, run.
So that one, that sounds like, so there's an intrusive thought that comes and goes really quickly, but then there's also the intrusive thought that sticks. So that would be like one that's.
Yeah. Did he die? Did he die?
Yeah. When I think of this one, I think of in mediations, that moment when you're going to open up to the opening statements of each party, and that the potential intrusive thought that you're not going to want anyone to know about, and you're going to try and hide it in there, and it didn't happen, and I'm not going to make an issue out of this because I really need to get on with it. Can anyone relate to that? No? Okay. That's all right. I'll continue on with the next one. So an intrusive thought that includes less closeness due to the other parent. So we may perceive this as a threat to closeness. It's not a threat to a person. It's not like we're not talking DV or anything like that. This is a threat to closeness, and closeness being the importance that I put on meeting your needs and you meeting my needs. Is there a different sensation for that?
I think that's a pretty common one in FDR, because when we're negotiating time, and your time means taking it away from me and taking my time, my closeness with the children.
Yeah.
At the moment, and I'm not sure about an intrusive thought, but it leads to their friends don't matter, other people don't matter, they need to be with me when in that measly little bit of time I get. I've got a client like that at the moment.
So we're being really protective, aren't we? And it's really quite insulated, but we're still talking about an intrusive thought. So it's still not something that they haven't said anything yet. You can't, there's no response. You don't know that they're actually experiencing that. So already the cortisol could be coming up, a bit of anger maybe that they're trying to push down. There could be some guilt because they're like in this mediation and they should be trying to be a certain way. And so already there's complex experiences coming up. Now we're getting heavier now. So a perceived threat to closeness from their child. Can anyone think of an example where they've heard that in a mediation even? Has anyone heard a parent tell the other parent what the child has said? How common is that? It's like dime a dozen. What would the experience of that be?
I think I've only had where I've had shuttle mediation and there has been a complete rupture between a child and a parent. And for the thought for them, say in this instance, the mum who has the child full time, the threat of having to agree to something in mediation, that means that the child is going to then be repairing that rupture, of then how that feels for her, because she's that wraparound approach she's had, trying to make sure she feels safe and heard and acknowledged. Okay, well, what this is going to look like. So for her, it was a real threat. It was and I guess that was the intrusive thought she was having, was the unknown of what that was going to look like.
Yeah, yeah. And with that complete rupture, was there any language there about how the child may have perceived their closeness?
With the parent with the rupture or the close?
Both.
Yeah. Look, I think the child had, I guess, looking, it was quite a while ago, thinking back to that, it was more the thought for the child to go with dad was scary. And there wasn't any reason. It was just how that's going to look. I'm not going to have mum there. I need to have access to mum. What's going to happen if I start feeling a little unsafe? Or in her view was, I need that access to mum. And then mum being, she felt like she just had to be there. You know, that for her it was that constant kind of fear or concern that the child was going to then need her right there and then.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Thanks, Amanda. Like, that's an extreme example. And I think for me now, whereas beforehand it used to be, it's only going to happen every now and then. But now that I'm looking at this content, I'm realizing that actually this is happening all the time. But we're just not noticing it. We're not used to looking at things these ways to see it. So which is why we end up, in my mind, my question is some of this leading to those scenarios that you've described there, which is horrible. And I think that's the one thing that we really don't want to contribute to, you know?
So again, as a mediator, you worry that you don't want to facilitate the mum's fear and kind of feed into that.
Yeah.
So you're trying to look at options, as you do, and then trying to just ease that for her. So, but in her space, she was just totally to the extreme, and you also need to acknowledge that too. So, yeah.
And also for the child, like
yeah.
Perceived threat to closeness is doubled down with both parents. How do they navigate that? The other thing I thought of with this scenario was whenever we do child inclusive practice, I can't imagine this not being experienced during that process. And even stronger and more intense when you start looking at people that have experienced family reports and child impact statements, and that, yeah, whereas a child inclusive practice is much more gentler.
Yeah.
I would imagine it's actually built into the training that I did with Jen McIntosh.
Yeah.
She didn't put it in these words, but I think that's what she was getting at.
Yeah, and in this case, we did end up doing that. We did the CIP purely because it was the parents. So then we needed to then understand, okay, we need to hear from the child.
Yes.
So, yeah.
And I also wonder now, like and I'm just thinking out loud, do the child consultants, do they actually look at this in terms of this grief language that we're now learning now? Do they, because I don't think that was part of that. I think it was an undercurrent, but it certainly wasn't obvious to us in the training. But I love the training that I did, so I'm not putting that down. I'm just saying that this is something that I've come across that I feel is important and new. So the next one, which is harder again, and I've already gone into it, is when we get a perceived threat to closeness from an NGO or a government agency. Is there any changes that we might see, any implications for closeness?
Yeah, sometimes people can go into a really extreme threat state and actually stop being as protective of the child as they need to because they're fearful that they'll be taken. So they'll lie or minimise or whatever real risks.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. Because
the threat, the power and the authority that these agencies have, compared to the other parent I find it quite horrible. The pressure that is then put on that spectrum of closeness for the individual, that something needs to be more important than that. When actually what we're trying to do is support that closeness. So we're actually doing the opposite. I also think about how we might see guilt turn into shame for those individuals. So what's their capacity then to engage in support compared to when they're, prior to mediation or during mediation, when we start amplifying the capacity to be able to honestly engage with and be authentic in our asking for help, becomes a lot harder because of that threat to closeness. Anything can be used.
Yeah, and that shame, really, I'm supporting someone who's an alienated mother. It's not in mediation, but her child won't have any contact with her, and so I'm trying to help guide her out of shame and guilt into practical and to some degree acceptance of the current situation.
I wonder with a client like that and you'll see when we get to the final slides, we'll be starting to look at referrals and what sort of supports we can actually do for what we're talking about, for the presentations that we're seeing. And that's why I think I'm taking more of a subtler approach with it now, so that we can.
Yeah, and I guess there's a spectrum. One is the frustration of not having as much closeness as they want, and then on the other end of having none, which is can have really profoundly negative effects on parents.
Absolutely, yes. So when a person is prevented, and I'm going into what you just said now, when a person is prevented from doing something to address the circumstance, mental health issues are likely to develop. At worst, this can become a basis for trauma when the person has an experience which is beyond their capacity to respond and to recover. So when we're starting to look at someone not being able to have any contact, and we've got a brain that has been transformed to protect and engage, what are we doing in terms of managing that trauma? And I think that's where we're now looking at risk management, risk mitigation, all that. So, and I'm just suggesting this is food for thought. I'm not saying that I'm not blaming anyone or anything like that. It's just more, we need to, maybe this is an opportunity to think about what we do. So I'm going to go into some more research. So there are now neuroimagery studies that have demonstrated that the tracking of the virtual map we create for our social environment. When people are not present in one's immediate reality, they can be gone for a few different reasons. These reasons could be for distance, for time, and for social closeness. We can form abstract ideas or construals of where they might be. We can use predictions, memories, and speculations to imagine the person. These mental representations transcend the immediate situation. The construal levels theory also suggests that the brain uses different dimensions to reasons for the absence of the person. So we can predict that if they are not where we expect them to be, they will be motivated to give us a call or to show up at home. Or on the other hand, we do not predict this behaviour for the people and not close to us. So thinking back to our thought exercise just previously, what reasons did you notice come up for you when placing yourself in the position of any of those scenarios? If you hear a parent make reference to the other person's relationship with a child, what are the risks? And will this impact the internal experience of closeness? So based on what we've just talked about on the previous slide, what else, does this add anything to that? We may have an intrusive thought. That intrusive thought could be because of something, some pressure that we experience in the environment. What might we do in terms of, I think one of the examples was receiving a threat to closeness from the child. Say we have a child that goes to one parent and then they don't make the phone call to the other parent. What sort of things might happen?
Anger and blame of the other parent.
Yeah. Is there anything else that they might do if that's not the, is there another alternative? Because that might be your first response, hey?
Oh, yeah. And sadness and distress. Yeah. Anxiety.
If we don't receive that call, then does it create distance? And then might we attribute that to the child? And what does that then do? Does it create more yearning or does it turn into grief? There's so many that this is where it's kind of like asking these questions of the client when they come up. When you notice these little scenarios, to us, we go, oh, yeah, that happens. Yeah, that's frustrating, but move on. We don't explore how that impacts on closeness, and then closeness impacts on the agreement that you end up working towards that might suit both parties, and also it impacts on their mental health after the fact. So this study asks participants to engage in, it's a particularly cool study that they did. They wrote a choose your own adventure story. You may not know what a choose your own adventure is, where you read a passage and then you have a choice that you need to make, and then it tells you to go to a different page and then you read more of that page. So you actually engage with the story. And they found that closeness evolved as participants continued with the story, and that distance was created when status surpassed their own. The campus was also involved in social tracking, which is memory. That's what we talked about last session. And there is an observable difference between physical pain in that there is an additional element that maps where the source of pain is in the body. The suffering associated with pain comes from the ACC and insula, thus emotional suffering from pain. Grief is a highly complex brain function, which includes regions that process pictures, words, emotions, taking the perspective of another person, recalling episodic memories, perceiving familiar faces, regulating the heart, and coordinating these processes. So what could the potential implications be, knowing that there is a neurological pathway that is not necessarily linked to the prefrontal cortex? I introduced this thought last time. What might this mean in terms of a mediation? we're stressing the brain. I would think that if through this already the brain is stressed and it's not engaging the prefrontal cortex, we need to do a lot of work to be able to get that decision-making capacity online. It's not just an assumption of they're in the room, so therefore we're going to focus. There's a lot, I suppose there's a bit on us to get them to actually participate in a way that's meaningful for them, not just for the outcome.
I guess that goes back to the example that I spoke about last time, where the guy couldn't remember the mediation that happened just shortly after their breakup at all. Couldn't. So it didn't go into his memory. It was, I suppose, his prefrontal cortex wasn't engaging.
Yeah. And I wonder, I can totally imagine how that could happen now. And now that I'm familiar with this a little bit more, I'm not attributing that to how close it was to the end of the relationship. I would attribute that to how much stress is going on for that person, that they may not be showing you because they may be trying to, come on, hurry up, get on with this because I just want to get out. It's too much for them. So, yeah. So what could the potential implications, learning that the process for grief does not necessarily engage that amygdala. That's the usual stress. When cortisol goes up, that's when we engage that amygdala. It's associated with trauma and fear. Remembering that grief is a different process to yearning. My thoughts at this point, I'm not sure. Are many of you trained in trauma-informed approaches? Anyone? Worried about people being triggered in your sessions?
Yeah, I think, yes, definitely. So understanding that triggering is not. Yeah.
Given that grief is not necessarily connected to that, just because someone's experiencing emotion in a session does not mean that they need a break. It's not necessarily a trauma response. It could be that they're experiencing something that's grief related that is an opportunity for learning. And we could actually do some really good work there.
Yeah, but how do you tell the difference?
That's right. And these are the big questions that I go, oh, hang on. Now, there's heaps of questions for research and for us to really explore, but I suppose not being afraid of the emotions when we see them in a room is important. Okay. Now, there may be, has anyone here done a lot of work with domestic violence? I'm just going to introduce the premise here that with domestic violence work, there is a strong correlation now between domestic violence and the perception of status. What they mean with that is that the person using violence tends to have a belief about status, and when that status is threatened, that's when the behaviours tend to come up. So I find it really interesting that in this study, it's not just looking at closeness, but status is right there in it as well. And I think that poses a lot of questions about, because status is a measurement of distance, and when that is threatened, it's that there is distance there and you're coming close to me, or you're threatening my status, which is, whereas when we look at parenting, we hope for it to be about closeness and creating distance, that the parents are looking for distance with each other. But then when there's already family violence, and so there's that dynamic of status, how do they all interact? How do they all play out?
Yeah, that's interesting. And separation can't not disrupt the status quo. Like, it disrupts the equilibrium if there was.
Yeah.
Inevitably, because it's a change in closeness, it's a change in cohabitation and all of the other.
Yeah, so there's some
physical
kind of emotional distance with status, but you still want them there so that you can control them, which reinforces your sense of status. That's maybe one way of thinking about it.
Yeah, and people some of the personality disorders, like you can't get too far away, you can't get too close, but once people get too far away, then there's an attack because
Absolutely.
that's the status. Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah, no, it's an interesting way of reframing the same. Yeah.
So that's where I'm okay. We're looking at this like closeness, and don't forget, closeness is our measure for attachment, whereas we don't really measure attachment when we go into mediations. We go, that's not our space, but that's where this is all pointing to. That's the way I interpret it at the moment anyway. And I think it might give us some hints on how we could do safety planning better, potentially. Okay, so I'm just going to ask you just to take a moment to read this. So when tracking transactional relationships, the measures by which we compare can be through the tracking of resources such as time, money, which is mine and yours. With attachment, the tracking is on when help is needed, such as caregiving or defending reputation. An overlap of resources becomes ours, and there is a greater importance of we than you and me. Identity develops on these relationships. So the loss of these relationships becomes a loss of identity, a loss of function, and a loss of self. So is there a role as an FDRP, mediator or therapist working with clients to move between you and I and we as functions and as identities? When we go into exploration, for example, how can our language influence it? My thoughts are, when thinking about it, our use of language could be that when we're looking at we're trying to transform a touch type relationship into more of a transactional type relationship between the parents, but also recognizing and supporting a attachment type relationship for the children. So the language of you, I, and defining what resources are important to talk about and how we talk about them. When we talk about children, do we talk about them as a transactional type thing, or do we talk about closeness? I think in the last session, I reflected on this a lot, that the use of the genogram, and I'm not sure how that person used the genogram, but I would think that now using that to go, okay, how does this person define closeness for them with their child? How does the child identify closeness with them and that parent, and do it for all the people in a genogram? And then potentially when you're going into the mediation, you've got some language there prepared, ready, so that when you're talking about children, how is this person going to feel connected with a child, even based on whatever suggestions they're putting forward? So changing the way we approach it may actually help with addressing some of the yearning. And that's just a thought.
Yeah, so I'm almost saying one's part of the genograms tracing genetics, and the other one you overlay with colours or something to trace closeness. Yeah.
And also what you could do, because I can imagine that you would see then when a parent feels threatened by the other parent, when they're going through the genogram and the intake, what is it that's sparking up that intrusive thought, that threat, that what's the sore, where is there like some there, and is there an option for some work to be done before the mediation, or is it something that could be processed during the mediation? Is it something that needs to go to a referral, outsourced to somebody to really unpack? So yeah, I'd suggest that our work is actually using the tension of closeness between each parent. So when I say tension of closeness, we're talking now about a continuum. So one person may be going, I just don't want to know you. I don't want to have anything to do with you. So they're still on that continuum of closeness, but they're just far in one side. And compared to the other side when they were together. Yeah, rather than going close versus distance, it's just, and you could even use their language, and you can draw a line and go, where are you? Where would you like to be with this person? Where are you at now? Where would you like to be with your children? Where are you now? And I don't think that's not just, I don't believe that's just the work of a therapist either. I think that's something that we could potentially do in intakes, and then continue that language on in the mediation. Like, you don't necessarily need to breach confidentiality by saying, this is what you said, but you can still use the same language that can bring it up. Okay, so all societies have rituals for processing grief, and is not simply the role of the individual to do in private. The sharing of connection when there is a loss transforms the present experience. What rituals do? My question is, we all may have experiences of rituals and with grief, like funerals and memorial. Just in introducing this concept, what rituals do families have when they go through separation? I'm going to leave this one to you guys, because you won't like my answer.
Ritual burning of personal effects? No, I don't think that. Yeah, no, look, it brings up for me that I think often as mediators we may steer away from even acknowledging, because we know that one parent has the ability and is using that ability to affect the closeness of the other, or so. Yeah, I think that there's probably more we can do around that social construct.
You know what? In saying that, and I totally agree with you, I'm actually now thinking that could potentially be because we don't have rituals.
Yeah.
So the impact of rituals is that it creates like a moment where we can experience a moment of loss. You remember before we were talking about grief, and yearning is when there is no memory of the loss. And the funerals and all those rituals support that, yes, there was a loss, there is a loss.
Yeah. And with separation, you know, the average, I don't know, 7-10 times people separate and go back together. So that's the date for a lot of people. It's not. Was it the first time or the last time? Amanda, I think you were going to say something too, were you? Or you just had a thinking face?
How many people, when you do an intake, go, okay, what was the date of your separation? What was that like on that day? Do we do that? Do we ask that?
We ask when it was. Yeah, I think usually. Some people don't. It's hard to say, but others, if it was separation by family violence order, it's generally easier, but yeah.
And then there'll be others that'll go, oh, yep, it's this date.
Oh, there's the ritual, the family violence order.
Yes. Yep. So that's definitely one. I worry about that one. But I go, maybe if we talk about, or we think about when we do our intakes, what those potential rituals that might suit them. And if they don't have any rituals, they don't have that connection with that there's been a change here, and that opportunity for the grief to actually start, for it to transcend from yearning to grief, then
yeah, I don't think it's a transcendent, but changing their Facebook profile from married to single.
Yes.
Another one. Yep. Making that decision.
Yep.
And then sometimes people respond, and that does create some wider connection around that change.
Yeah. Sometimes it's telling the family, because that's a common one with a loss, when there's a death, that they're calling up the family, and then the family come and they wrap round, and then there's a shared experience of the loss, and that's like that kind of helps with the creation of memories, because that's what we're trying to do with the rituals. We're creating memories so that there's a scaffolding that can happen.
But in this sort of grief, isn't it almost a rejection of the other? When you lose someone, it's usually positive memories, sometimes rose-coloured memories. But
Freedom.
Yeah, but with separation, sometimes I guess there's a demonization or there's a rejection of the full picture. And would that be helpful? I'm not sure that it is.
I don't know. This is what we would be exploring that with each scenario. The other thing also is I've mentioned there about ambiguous loss. Has anyone read up about or learned anything about ambiguous loss?
What do you mean by that?
I actually don't know a huge amount about it yet. I say yet because that's going to be my next thing that I'm probably going to start running towards. But so when the process of grieving is derailed or misdirected or something happens, you can end up with ambiguous loss. So that's where you end up with greater distress, and it carries on over time. So when I think about ambiguous loss, I think about the person who now has a parenting plan, may or may not have a parenting plan, but let's go with they have a parenting plan now, and when they have the child, they're full on parent mode. And then when the day comes, when Thursday comes or whatever day it is, when Thursday comes, I'm not a parent anymore. What do I do? And then the next week, I'm the parent. Oh, but hang on, when I don't have the child, I'm not meant to have responsibilities, but I'm also meant to on some level, like I'm meant to do something around the house to get ready for the next week. Or you see what I'm saying? There's a real, it's not clear-cut grief like we do when we think someone's passed away. The person is still there, and we still have our identity is still connected to it on some level.
I think when there is a parenting plan, when there's a regular schedule and that, it's less ambiguous. But where parents, like, they'll often come to us and it's arbitrary when they are allowed, and that goes to the status as well, where one parent sometimes allows them to have time with their child, and that creates that would be an ambiguous loss because they really have very little control over it, but it's not.
So I think when I now then go to like space, time, closeness. The parenting plan provides, at the moment, the way that we write them up, space and time, but they don't necessarily use the language of closeness. So therefore, that's left open for them to kind of suss out.
Yeah. I suppose a plan that says the children can call any time that they want, not just at 6 p.m. on Tuesdays. Those would have more closeness, perhaps, than...
Could do if they actually did call.
Yeah. Yeah.
If they don't call, what does that then mean?
Yeah, it's the opposite. Yeah, good point.
Okay, so what sorts of things could get in the way of a person connecting with loss? We're now looking at what sort of things could get in the way that could contribute to ambiguous loss.
I think when I think of parenting plans as such is, and I know this could be completely off track, is really the age of the kids. For me, that sort of just jumps to mind when they're little, and it's up to the parent to say, hey, it's time to ring mum or dad. It's another task you have to do when the kids are in the care that then makes you think of the other parent, and you're constantly doing that. Whereas when they're older, so thinking when they're little, when you want to be checking on them and making sure they're okay and doing all that, because you do have that really significant loss being little. And whereas when they're older and they've got phones and everything and they actually contact you via text, so the onus is off the parent to actually then prompt all that. So that's what sort of pops to my head when I think about that.
Yeah. Another thing I think about also is the impact of those other people around them. You might have a grandmother that might think that it needs to be done a certain way. So that person, the way that they try and they go into that mediation is then limited in being able to go through their own learning experience. It's hijacked. There'd be heaps of examples of ways that our current processes interfere with loss. And like I suggested before, like our use of language, but also like our use of time can interfere with it as well, because these are emotions and they aren't necessarily, we're trying to fit something in a box and it may not belong in that box, and you're dealing with two people that have very different experiences and on very different pathways with that yearning and grief and what's important and what they hope for the future. There's so much complexity in it that I think being responsive and having an ear for what's happening for them in terms of grief is really important to make sure that they don't end up becoming unwell in the longer term. So I think last time someone mentioned emotion contagion. I've got an exercise for us to do here. Let's just start off by suggesting that empathy consists of a cognitive perspective taking part. There's an emotional empathy part, so feeling the way the other person is feeling. And then there's also the compassion part, so the motivation to care. For this exercise, I want you to just imagine that you've got someone in your mediation room, and I want you to notice when I state these presentations, notice the shift in you in terms of the cognitive stuff, the thinking stuff that you're thinking, the emotion, empathy, and the compassion, the things that are going to motivate you to do something or your response. So the first one, just imagine if you've got a client in your room and they're showing humour, they're laughing away. Just take a notice of how that feels for you. And now we're going to move to sadness in the room. And notice the shift in you. Anger, someone's starting to fire up. Guilt. Notice the change. Fear. Doubt and mistrust. And confusion. How did we experience that transition between each of those emotions? Did anyone notice anything at all?
Yeah, I was feeling the echo of the emotions as you're naming them.
Could you get a sense that there is actually the cognitive part, the empathy part, and the compassion?
Yeah, I guess so. I was just probably going more into the empathy, like the feeling of the emotion, rather than trying to rationalise too much. There wasn't enough time.
Yeah, it's quick, because when it's in the room, it can also be really quick. And they may not know that they're experiencing that, and your body will respond to it. So you're like suggesting that the empathy is the way to highlight for you. That's how you notice a shift. For some people, if they feel that they're not feeling very comfortable with the emotion being in the room, they might take more of a cognitive approach. I don't know. I'm just putting this out there, like how do we respond to changes in the room? And that's going to help us to respond to the grief or the yearning in the room.
Yeah, I guess my training and background, I tend to use my body as a bit of a barometer, rather than, oh, they said something that's, I'm using that, I guess, to bring my attention to the thinking of, okay, how do I need to respond in this moment?
Yeah. I know that with my training, it was very much taking the cognitive thing on. You had to really.
Oh, yeah, no, I didn't mean my mediation training, other trainings that I've done.
Yeah.
Yeah, very much the cognitive because as a trainer, it's hard it's a deeper level of training to do that. Yeah.
And even with some therapists, they struggle. There's a tension with this because there's a worry about transference and counter-transference and all that sort of stuff. The compassion, I wonder whether that is that part of us that actually then helps us to decide what we say, where we steer the conversation, and how we interpret each of those emotions is really important, because we may see the anger and be going, oh, they're being aggressive, they're not trying to participate, when in actual fact that anger could be the grief finding a voice. It could actually be an indication that the violence had been happening before, and having that a really good intake and an understanding of their background is like ultra important.
Can I just sorry, Mary, I'm really enjoying this. Thank you. And I missed last week, but I had a quick catch up just before now. Can I just all of this, what we're talking about just here, with the perspective of happy, sad, the emotions that are being shown within the room. For me, as a mediator, it's about an understanding of how many emotions can go within a very short period of time with a client. For me, it would be about, certainly it's about acknowledgement, it's about respect for what they have with their emotions, but also, to me, it's about having stability within myself to control myself with the emotions that I'm hearing about. So I think that's a bit of training as well. I don't know if that's how you would be looking at this.
Yeah. So when you say control within yourself, what does that feel like?
As I say, I think it's a bit of training within that, but it's about an understanding of what they're feeling and not being reactive in a way that's going to exacerbate their feelings. So if we're more in control of our own emotions within the mediation room, I think it's for us to be a little bit more stable and controlling of our own emotions. So it's not our position to be emotional with them. It's our position to acknowledge, to respect, to listen, to have empathy. So I was hoping that in itself gives us some kind of an understanding and control and stability in reacting.
So it sounds like for you then that the cognitive perspective taking is that this is my role and this is how I'm here to support you.
Yes, I think so.
And then the compassion bit is like okay, and this is how I'm going to do it.
It gives you the guidance to be able to provide them.
Yeah, good. That's interesting, because sometimes I listen to mediators after a particularly challenging one, and then they'll start doing the attributing. And so that's when I wonder, I wasn't in the room when it happened, but I'm wondering like how much of the attributing stuff is going on to manage those frustrations that are coming up in us, because we can't, I don't know, there's a bit of a...
Yeah, are we perspective taking or judging?
Yeah, and I don't think that there's any right answers with this at this point. I'm not in a position to be saying, hey, this is how you should be responding to these emotions, because it's just too... It's too complicated. Sometimes humour is a coping thing because they're way over, and like they're not able to engage, so they may use humour. Then it could be that they're using humour to regulate the other person, because when we look at emotional contagion, that's not necessarily a cognitive thing. That is a body regulation thing. So when we enter a room with someone else, our body will actually regulate to match and adjust with the other person, and that's an automatic thing that we all do. So how we manage that?
Yeah, I think it's connected to rapport, and that deep rapport where you see people walking along the street in step, they haven't okay, we'll start with our left foot and then our right. It just, it happens. But it's, as the professional in the room, as the practitioner, I guess we need to have the cognitive awareness of what's happening in that instinctive level in our body. So it's not, having awareness that we may be catching it from them, and then that helps us. But if we don't use empathy, then we're going to be out of rapport with them.
Yeah.
And often that can lead to a further escalation because they're not feeling understood or seen.
Yeah. And Mary Frances, she talks about this specifically in the book because she says we're actually hardwired for this with grief. And so when we do yearning, when we do that response, our body is actually giving off something, and we're actually requesting others to engage in our search. That's the dynamic of it. So that's part of that emotional contagion. So when someone's yearning in a room, you might feel something different in you compared to a grief response, but you might be seeing these different emotions as well with that.
Yeah. And sometimes if that's allowed in the room, the other person can get the contagion and maybe they start to have a little bit more compassion, because in their grief, sometimes they lack compassion for the other person.
Yeah.
Which creates a vicious cycle.
All right. So Mary Frances introduces a theory called Gone But Everlasting theory. So while the information we've talked about so far is challenging, I believe this present slide is probably the most fundamental in my own reflection of the grieving brain. So implicit semantic knowledge is subconscious. It is not mind-wandering, and it's not a memory of a time or a place that is clear and categorical like a photograph. It is the subconscious knowledge of closeness. I cannot choose to not think of my son when I walk past his door. It is simply going on in the background always. So when that door comes to some subconscious awareness, closeness occurs and I will respond to it subconsciously. I may not be aware, but you as a mediator may or may not see it as my body responds to that closeness measure. When we touch a change in relationship, we touch a change in closeness, and learning needs to occur. Those tough moments in your mediation rooms are moments of measuring closeness, identifying a discrepancy, and their brain trying to learn. Their experience of closeness and the social construction that you represent contributes to that learning. Does anyone have a similar response to what I had when I came across, or is it, what does that mean? I think what I'm saying here is that there is whenever we talk about anything to do with a house, for example, like it doesn't even need to be a child. You mention the word house. That is going to have an indication linked to closeness for whatever's happened in the past. Automatically, you're going to be bringing up, or that person is going to be accessing that implicit semantic knowledge.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. In the frame of reference, because when that's triggered, like it's the time distance doesn't make any difference. It's not less because it was 10 years ago if it pops up because you drive past where the car accident happened and someone died or whatever. That it may, it's not on a timeline of being further away in most cases.
So this, for me, changes the language from when I see grief or when I see grieving is to how is the grieving showing at the moment. It's not an if scenario for me anymore. It's a how. It's going to, if they're presenting in front of me and they want a mediation, there's going to be a change in relationship. That's what they're there. That's what they're asking for. That by that premise alone, there is an adjustment in closeness that is going to happen. That's what they're asking for us to facilitate that. And they want the language to be through time and space. And we can add more language if we choose to. That then poses the question to me, how am I going to support this family on their grieving process as a mediator or as a therapist. Because if I do it wrong, that's when we mess up the stuff with closeness, and that can then lead to trauma. Okay, so there is a model that's been accepted for the last 20 years that's had some good outcomes, where they, instead of, because you know how we talked about, we're all trained in, not all of us, but we're familiar with the 5-stage model where you go through one stage and the next stage and the next stage. This is like the next version. So the dual process model for coping, a person through the grieving process will experience 2 different types of stresses, and we oscillate between these 2 stresses. When we are in one stressor, we're denying and suppressing the other, and both are necessary for grief work. When looking at this separation of 2 processes, what is the relationship between past, present, and future for the loss-orientated stresses? So just have a look at what we've got on the slide. Just looking at the loss-orientated stresses, what indications are there of past, present, and future?
A lot of past focus, I would have thought.
Rumination is when we're putting the present into the present is the past, but the others is more like there's a tension there between the 2, and how we interact with that is the yearning, the remembering, the reflecting. And we see that in our mediations at the moment, and we mentioned last time that we've been trained to go, no, we shouldn't be engaging in that space. But I think now when we look at this, is that there's going to be moments that happen, and how we respond to that is really important, and probably shutting it down may not be the best option, because it could actually, if someone's yearning and you try and shut that down, that could send the message. I'm not saying it always does, but it could send the message that, yep, you're worried about losing connection with whatever. That's not important. And what would that do? That would make someone go crazy, I think. I know what it would do to me. I'd be in a rage after that, because I would be more protective then, and I'll be seeing you as the enemy. You're creating a barrier for me trying to connect, even though that may not be your intention. That's how the automatic response might. The other one is the restoration orientated stresses. What is there like in terms, is there any indication of past, present, and future with this one?
So they'd be very present and future. Yeah.
Yeah. And again, there's a tension between the 2. And each of those dot points present a different challenge. So that's where your loss of identity will come up in that part. How do they navigate that? What do they do? If they say, yeah, okay, you can have Joe on a Tuesday, what am I going to do with that time on a Tuesday now? Are they going to be thinking about that in the room? Or is that something that they need to deal with on their own later? Is that a potential that we might actually do some follow-up work with them afterwards? I don't know. These are questions to think about. Oh, hang on, let me go back. So what role would a mental health clinician participating with the use of this model engage with loss-orientated stress? What do you think they would do to help this person forward?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
We've got a mental health clinician, so we're now starting to think about our roles in this. What role would a mental health clinician have in engaging? So they see a loss-orientated stressor. What's their role? What would they do? Or what should they do? Think about a referral that you might make for someone. What would you hope that clinician would do?
I'd hope that they'd validate the loss and help them to navigate that change in focus towards creating a new picture for the future. Yeah. This is something that I see a lot because people have got a whole future that's been stolen, and that all of the yearning and the rumination about whatever it was that they were going to do together or as a family that's now gone. As you've been talking about, it's not gone. It's still there inside them.
Yeah. One of my frustrations that I have when I'm in that mediator role and I've made a referral is that quite often the client will come back and there'll be more like entitlement, more I've done my work and they're obviously in the wrong. And when really, I think if we sent referrals that were grief informed, we would probably get a different response. I'm not sure what you guys, I'm really open to hear what you guys have experienced when you send referrals to a mental health clinician, because that's been my experience. And I find it frustrating because I'm trained in that area as well.
Yeah, I think sometimes there's a real disconnect between the context of what people need to do to progress their resolving the separation issues in mediation and what they're doing in the mental health treatment, which can be very focused on validating the individual rather than them
Which
thinking.
doesn't help with your loss processing.
No.
It does the opposite. It creates more yearning.
I've certainly experienced that with clients.
So that's what, when I read this, I went, oh my God, that wasn't just me imagining this. This is actually probably what's happening. Okay, so now let's look at what we would hope a mental health clinician would do with restoration.
When you're talking about restoration, do you mean family restoration or?
Sorry, the restoration orientated stresses.
Oh, okay.
That's me being lazy.
Sorry. Okay, yeah. Yeah. Oh, we hopefully help them, because often people are very stuck in the loss orientated. Help them to, I suppose, find some acceptance that they do have to develop a new picture.
Yeah. I think if me as the therapist now knowing what I know, I would hope that the mental health professional would support them to develop new identities and to develop how are they going on a daily basis with their routines. How are they going to, because she does a metaphor like that grief is like a phantom limb. The one minute it's there and the next it's gone. How do you just all of a sudden function without an arm? There's a whole process. And I wonder about our referrals that we make, whether they're aware that this is what's necessary, not the other that's happening. So let's now turn it to the FDRP that's participating. What's the role of the FDRP in working with the loss orientated stresses?
Yeah, I guess for me, again, it's that acknowledgement of the loss and in some ways allowing them to articulate that, whatever way they want to. But the other is providing hope, because sometimes the hopelessness and not having that restoration side field can be, people can die from that. Yeah.
I think about having an awareness of yearning, having an awareness of rumination, understanding that rumination is a normal part of grieving, but then knowing how to respond to that, being aware of it in an intake, and then thinking about, if this happens is this something that you think about a lot? Yes or no? Is it something that you're stuck on? What are our options? Do we go to a mediation when someone's ruminating and it's beyond? So having that awareness, I think, is a starting point. Restoration orientated stresses. How do FDRPs, how can we work with this?
I think when you're looking at the now and the future is, again, referring back to that time and space. When you say it is about when you're developing a parenting plan, they see time with a child or what that's going to look like. So I think for me, when I conduct mediations, it is allowing them time to adjust to that new relationship. What is that going to look like for now? And maybe then we revisit when everyone has adjusted to then what it looks like further forward and move through that process without having to make those big decisions right there and then.
Yeah. Do you find, Amanda, that sometimes parents are reluctant to book more than one mediation?
In my experience, I find that probably majority of them, yes, they just want it there because they don't want to have to go through the process of coming back. But for me, I tend to book them in on that day and say, let's have a look 3-6 months down the track. And it just eases them a little bit to go, okay, we've got a booking. If everything's going really well, fine, we don't need it, but it's there if we need it. I find that, again, referring back to that time space, that not having to, that they're also moving through then that yearning and reflecting and everything. Yeah.
Do you think having a language that has a little bit of grief in it would influence their motivation for a second follow-up?
Yeah, absolutely. And it is, again, as Joanne said, acknowledging that, allowing them to feel that they've been heard and that it is, and normalizing it. That we see this all the time, and we're not saying that you're exactly like every client that walks through the door. Every situation's different, but they feel that sense of this is going to be okay. Yeah.
Okay. So when to make a referral? So we've talked a little bit about referrals already, and I've already mentioned that perhaps grieving isn't necessarily when and if, it's more it is happening, and that could be our starting point. But Bonanno did a study of 4 trajectories for the loss of a partner and identified that in 50% of cases there was no depression present. With chronic grieving, this would begin after the loss. Chronic depression begins before the loss and continues or worsens, and depressed improved was maybe experiencing depression, and this decreases after the loss. So I kind of just jumped ahead of myself, but what sort of implications would this have for us in terms of making referrals? Does it raise questions, or is there any assumptions that we've had in the past that are being challenged? Why did they measure depression, do we think?
Yeah, no, that's interesting. It makes sense. It's pretty obvious, because sometimes the depression can be related to the thing they lose. And so they get a relief, a rebound.
Amanda, were you going to say something, or should I keep? Okay.
Or I was just having my lunch, so I just turned my video off.
Oh, that's okay. So one thing that this highlights to me, like blazingly obvious, is that in the majority of, or in 50% of cases, someone is still experiencing grief. It's just, it doesn't look like it's a problem. It doesn't, they're resilient. They've got networks around them. They've got all these different ways of traveling through that, the relearning, the engaging with memories, having moments for soothing, and being able to respond to these scenarios. There's also an indication that there were things that were happening before the loss that interacts with, that can then look like an improvement, or it can look like it's getting really bad. When we do our intakes, asking about what was it like before the separation isn't just looking at, okay, risk factors, but it's also looking at how might their trajectory for grief continue on. Also, it highlights that there is a connection, or we confuse grieving with depression. There's also been some research there where they've also looked at grief versus PTSD, so anxiety. So quite often we might see someone in mediation and we go, oh my God, they're depressed, when really it could be that there could be a problem with grief. And the way that we respond to that is different, because Mary Frances says, so it's not just me, she says, if you medicate someone for depression, then what's their capacity for learning from those experiences? We've literally just cut it off. If someone is experiencing grief, medication can help with the depressive elements, but you still want them to be able to, if they're going to be working on the grief, we need to support learning experiences. And mediation is one of those potential experiences. She also says that so complicated, and quite often you'll see a preoccupation of yearning and trauma symptoms associated with the loss. There's issues with all of this clinical stuff because they're still trying to suss out definitions and what fits where and how and all that sort of thing. But what they have shown is that when we start looking at the criteria for complicated grief, they see a reduced brain volume and reduced cognitive function and speed, which will then influence the capacity of the client to be able to consider options and make decisions that are definitive. It may be, let's try it out for a few weeks if it doesn't work. And
have they got any theories about why the brain volume reduction occurs? Or
the jury's out. So she does talk about, there's a question of which one came first. Was it that there's a problem and then
that may be causing them to be less resilient?
And so they're really careful with that, because you don't want to be getting something like that wrong.
No.
You don't want to be saying, because you've got grief, then you're not going to be able to think.
There's just a correlation at this stage,
So could it be that we need better ways to identify what's in front of us so that we know when to make a referral and who to make a referral to? For example, if we see yearning, grief, anger, trauma, or a response to restoration. So during the week, in reflecting on this content, I responded to, there was a Facebook post about a week ago or during the last week where there was a question about how long to give someone who's dragging out the scheduling for a mediation. And the issue was a time constraint and holding the other party back, and which we're all familiar with, So if we applied a grief-informed lens to this, rather than going straight to a certificate, could we do some background work first? Is there reluctance due to a lowered capacity to function, to make decisions or to respond to pressure? Because if we do just send out a certificate for that, what's the trajectory likely to be?
Into court, but if they're really struggling, is mediation going to be appropriate for them as well? So, there's a number of factors. Or maybe if we're more grief informed, we can provide better support in mediation
throughout the process, so it doesn't get to that point.
Interesting. So I'm just mindful we're almost out of time as well.
Sorry, I'll quickly sum up. Hang on. Let me go back. So there is a therapy that Mary Frances recommends, and it's called Complicated Grief Therapy, CGT. And there is good evidence that clients recover 70% to CGT compared to other forms of therapy. CGT is a 16-week intensive program that engages all the factors that we talked about before. Other responses for grief that are pretty good is EMDR. And also I sort of encourage us not to think about over-diagnosing somebody or attributing something because it is so complex, but thinking about how grief is shown in the room might help with when we do what. Yeah, I'll just finish up there. Does anyone have any questions about that, about the therapy even?
No, but it's made me realise that I probably need to look at my referrals a bit more closely and think about if I do think that someone's really struggling with grief, are there therapists that would be more suitable to send to refer them to?
There are also structured assessment tools that you can use that are pretty easy to use.
Yeah.
And I'm having a look at them now.
Yeah, look, if you have some that you think might be useful, we can put a link below the video as well for people to have a look at. Because often for people, getting some cognitive awareness might be the first step towards thinking about looking at other ways that they can move before it gets what is intense, complicated grief. That. Any final thoughts? Anyone? Questions? Comments? Greg, very interesting. Thank you. It's definitely got me thinking.
Just as a lasting thought, Mary Frances she uses a metaphor right at the end that adolescence is a time when children reassess and change their relationships with their parents. And what sort of things do we see then? We see thoughts of death, thoughts of death is just like a normal exploratory type thing. There's suicide ideation, there's substance abuse, there's conflict, there's all sorts of things going on there. And she draws a parallel that when we start looking at changing our level of closeness, how similar they actually look.
Yeah. Yeah, I've always thought teenage, like the 2 or 3 year old, when when kids are really starting to become a separate person, and teenage, like that 10-year cycle. I thought them similar, but that's a different frame of looking at it. But it is, So
thank you for allowing me to share this.
No, thank you very much, Mary. And for anyone that came in late, we've just put the recording from last week on the Mediation Institute YouTube channel, just visible to the public. And we'll do the same with this one, because it really are important concepts and we want people to stumble across it if they can and think about it. So I think that's really great. And thank you so much, Mary. It really has been thought-provoking, and I think a conversation that can continue.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks heaps.
Thanks, everyone.